Well, hello fellow cosplayers. This is that cosplay guy Michael, and I am here to present you my second episode of my adventures into cosplaying, cosplayers, exploring the hows, whos, whats, wheres, whens, and whys. So, this time, this one hopefully will be a bit shorter than the previous one. It's going to be the history of cosplay again, but in this case it's the history of cosplay in Australia. So, in light of that, I got my Australian hat on. It's Crocodile Dundee. It's iconic. It's old, but it's iconic, you know. G'day, mate. I make no apologies. Sorry. I got my paper. I got my coffee. It's a bit hot. It's hot coffee. Grand Theft Auto players will get that reference. Hot coffee is good. Giggity. Anyway, let's get into it. History of cosplay in Australia. So, Australia's history with the cosplay scene is reasonably new in comparison to histories of, say, America or Japan or England. However, while most cosplay researchers will say that Australia's history with the cosplay scene started in 1998, when 3 anime fan clubs in Melbourne got together and they made a barbecue, they would be incorrect. Australia's history with cosplay and costuming actually goes all the way back to the 1950s. So let's go all the way back then. After everything had relatively settled down in the aftermath of World War II, and the populace of Australia has returned their focus from wartime efforts to more mundane and fun things, the first Australian National Science Fiction Convention was created and held in Sydney in 1952. This convention was based on similar science fiction conventions held in America, where back then cosplay was known as fan costuming. Cosplay conventions and get-togethers were known as masquerades. Cosplayers were known as fan costumers. Now, on a byline, 1939, this is like 20 years before the Sydney Convention, 1939, the Australian government placed an embargo on American pulp magazines. Now, little pulp magazines are like, I can describe, little magazines about the size of your hand, slightly bigger. They usually were the source of science fiction stories or little comics and stuff like that in them, and they were distributed amongst fans and stuff like that. They're like fan magazines. But they were the main source of science fiction for Australia back then. And they were imported from America. It was very rare for Australia to have their own science fiction authors or writers and stuff like that. Imported from England, from America. And yeah, not Japan. Not yet. So, anyway, the Australian government had made a decision to place an embargo on these pulp magazines. That means that they were banned. They were not allowed to be brought in. This decision was prompted by an importation crisis due to an ongoing war, World War II, and the insistence by the moral majority who claimed that comics and other objectionable material like sci-fi and fantasy were undermining society's morality. The only authentic science fiction magazines to reach Australia in this period arrived on ships, on warships and stuff like that. The crew had their own stash of magazines that they would share or swap when they hit harbour. This embargo would not be lifted by the government because Australian government. It would not be lifted until 13 years after the war ended. That's 1958. So when the 1952 Australian National Science Fiction Convention was held, the embargo that the Australian government had on science fiction pulp magazines was still on. So the government was out of touch with their people, even back then. What can you do? Sorry, I got a bit political there. It was, Australia. Moving on, 1975. Through a committee vote, Melbourne hosted the 33rd World Science Fiction Convention. Now, for those of you that actually managed to suffer through my previous episode on the worldwide history of cosplay and costuming, you will know that the World Science Fiction Convention was pretty much the largest science fiction convention. Each year, they hold a vote to decide where in the world, the convention will be held the next year. A bit like the Olympics. Except while the Olympics is held every 3 years or so, the World Science Fiction Convention is held every year. So anyway, for the 33rd World Science Fiction Convention, it was voted that it would be held in Melbourne for the first time ever. 1975. Dubbed AussieCon, this convention is considered to be a significant event in the development of Australian activity in science fiction and fantasy in general. And for properly introducing costuming culture to Australia. So yeah, pretty much wherever the Worldcon goes, it is the catalyst, the spark that lights the flame of science fiction, fantasy, and costuming culture for whichever country it pops up in. So basically everyone gets a nice taste of what the culture is like when the convention comes in, and when the convention leaves, well, people still love it, so they start making their own culture and stuff like that. In this case, costuming. People had a taste of costuming, and they wanted it to continue. So they brought it along into their own Australian science fiction conventions after that convention. Having said that, even without costuming culture, there were costumes in Australia. We have the theme parks, such as Dreamworld and Warner Brothers Movie World, although most of these would be developed years after the Worldcon came in. What I'm talking about is mascot costumes, by the way. So we have, they have a famous history of hiring mascots and costumers to portray iconic characters. We have sports teams and their mascots that show up in every large-scale stadium sporting event. But costume culture, as we know it now in cosplay culture, had not been developed. For these mascots and these theme park entertainers, it was just a job that they seldom took with him after the shift had ended. While in cosplay, it's a hobby for us 24/7. Okay, so anyway, since the Worldcon, Australia's conventions continued ongoing. They held science fiction and fantasy conventions and stuff like that. Fan costuming grew and continued, following the latest trends. But it was all Western orientated. It was based on what America or what England was doing. So we had costumes from Flash Gordon, Star Trek, Doctor Who. We had Star Wars, Planet of the Apes. We had stuff from novels and games such as Lord of the Rings and Dungeons and Dragons. And then we had comic books, so like DC and Marvel, and the Independents, so like Red Sonja and Spawn. Until 1996, when Australian-based film distributor Madman Entertainment began distributing Japanese anime and manga through the country, and the Japanese animation phenomenon began hitting Western shores. Seen as a new and fascinating cultural trend, interest in Japanese pop culture grew and fermented. And then, 3 anime and video game university clubs in Melbourne decided to get together in 1998 and have a 6-hour-long mass barbecue to raise funds for their clubs. They share their interests and they watch anime during this 6-hour-long public barbecue. The barbecue was considered a success, and the get-together became an annual event, growing larger and larger each year until 2001, when it officially became known as Manyfest, the first and largest convention in Australia to focus solely on Japanese anime, manga, and video games at that time. While initially held on the campus of the University of Melbourne, the convention soon outgrew the campus and it was moved into the Melbourne Showgrounds, becoming its own convention known as Manifest. Now, it should be noted that the model of Manifest was based on the model of the anime and manga conventions being held in Japan. It was not based on the model of the Western science fiction conventions held in America and England. And as such, Manifest brought with all the cultural and trends associated with Japan, not America. But it was new, it was bright, it was loud, and it almost overnight costuming became known as cosplaying, and masquerades became known as cosplay competitions. Fan costumers became known as cosplayers, due to the new generation of youth becoming interested in anime and manga, or Manifest. So they identify themselves as cosplayers. Meanwhile, the then already established generation, the older generation, that have been costuming for years through the science fiction conventions still want to call themselves costumers, or fan costumers, and call the competitions masquerades. So here we have a very sudden conflict between two generations using different terms for the same thing, and they start vying for their right to exist, I suppose. Now note that this was late 90s. The late 90s, early 2000s, the rise of cosplay culture began in Australia. So, even though costuming had existed in Australia since the 1950s, and costuming professions such as park entertainers and sports mascots had existed for years, even in the early 2000s, there were very few commercially available costumes for cosplayers. Aside from child-size party costumes, Santa suits and Easter Bunny suits, and fetish costumes for those who want to play at home. This may be in no small part due to the culture of Halloween. Didn't exist in Australia at this time. Australia had no reason to celebrate Halloween. That is actually a very recent tradition that we have now adopted, largely due to our reliance on American TV. So we had no Halloween, so we had no Halloween stores. So we had no stores filled to the brim with costumes and stuff like that. So costumers and cosplayers, we had to make our own from scratch. This resulted in cosplayers and those wishing to become cosplayers to develop an interest in what is known as traditional domestic crafts, such as sewing and leatherwork, during an age when such interests were thought to be uninteresting to the youth. So yeah, the cosplay generation, the brand new cosplay generation, became interested in the old domestic crafts and stuff like that. So in that way, it was good, I suppose, to continue the old crafts and traditions and stuff like that. It was useful, the cosplay culture rise in Australia. In these times, fan costumers and cosplayers had to be self-reliant, self-motivated, and resourceful when creating their costumes, which, again, had to be made from scratch because we had no stores to buy full costumes from. Meaning only a certain type of person fully became a cosplayer or a costumer. However, as the popularity of geek pop culture grew and it became cool amongst the general masses, paraphernalia associated with costuming and cosplay began appearing in larger quantities on shelves and stores devoted to anime and manga. It became a commercially viable endeavor instead of a pointless indulgence for those commercially minded store owners. So suddenly commercially made costumes for adults were being sold alongside child costumes at local stores, and officially produced prop replicas were available. Suddenly you could see Sailor Moon wands on your local toy shop, 1-to-1 scale. It was great. Sparkly, loud, did a lot of music, but great. Suddenly everyone could gain a costume and cosplay if they wished. Props and costumes pre-made and readily available, and numbers of cosplayers attending Australian conventions increased exponentially, as did the number of conventions. And so, in 2002, AVCon and Animania were developed, and Comic Fest expanded its focus from science fiction to include anime and video games, and rebranded itself as Supernova. This is actually a trend amongst science fiction or anime conventions that you see worldwide, that originally they would be solely focused on either Western science fiction and fantasy, or they'll be devoted to Japanese anime and manga. Personally, I think this was a self-preservation maneuver that a convention would decide to incorporate both science fiction and anime into the one convention, so that they had a more larger topic to cover, and sell goods and get guest stars and do speakings and whatnot, stuff like that. So those conventions became known as pulp culture conventions, no longer science fiction conventions or anime and manga conventions. They became known as pulp culture conventions because the entire thing's known as pulp culture. So anyway, sorry, babbling. So Supernova was developed. In the following years, conventions ventured outward from Sydney and Melbourne to hold additional conventions in other capital cities around the country, including Brisbane, Perth, the Gold Coast in Queensland, and Adelaide. Tasmania developed their own conventions, and the famous Armageddon convention in New Zealand also expanded its conventions into Australia before opting to expand its convention to encompass the entire city of Wellington instead. See, this is why Armageddon is noteworthy. It's not just situated in the one convention hall. The entire city celebrates. It has events everywhere during that weekend. Sometimes it's not even that weekend, it's for the entire week. It is an event itself. Armageddon, New Zealand. Check it out. Okay, come 2009. Madman Entertainment, these are the guys that were originally responsible for the distribution of anime and video games from Japan to Australia. They launched the first Madman National Cosplay Championship. This was a cosplay convention this was a cosplay competition where the participants are judged based on their skits and acting skills, not necessarily the quality of their costume. You could look like crepe, but sing very well, and you'll get points. Okay, the Madman National Cosplay Championship was hosted by numerous conventions around the country, such as Supernova, AVCon, AICon, and Overload. And the same year, Australia was also invited to participate in the World Cosplay Summit, held in Japan. The World Cosplay Summit is a cosplay competition held in Japan. Its competitors are from all over the world. It is considered the apex cosplay competition. So yes, Australia was invited to participate, and of course we said yes. So, conventions and competitions were not the only realms that Australia cosplays started appearing to exhibit their costumes. As the internet developed, so too did visual media outlets such as YouTube, hello, and Facebook, and social communication avenues like blogs and podcasts were now readily available and exploitable. Seemingly overnight, cosplay idols and champions were hosting their own video channels and radio shows to share as much as they could about their craft to whomever would listen. I feel like I just got called out. So when Madman Entertainment created its own convention and took over hosting duties of the national cosplay competition, Supernova decided to create its own cosplay competition, known as the Supernova Cosplay Odyssey, in 2018, and they based their point system on technical construction of costumes instead of the skits. So Madman Entertainment did their judging based on a cosplayer's performance, while Supernova based their competition on the quality of the costume instead of their acting skills. So Australia cosplayers had a choice about which type of competition they could attend. However, unfortunately, come 2020, a worldwide pandemic, COVID-19, caused the temporary ceasing of all public events and get-togethers, shutting down all conventions and public gatherings as part of a countrywide quarantine measure in an attempt to prevent the spread of the virus. And I gotta say, I think we did pretty good overall. And this brings us to present day, 2022, and the lifting of all quarantine measures, and conventions and competitions and get-togethers have returned, and cosplayers and costumers are once again free to indulge in a culture that continues to grow and evolve with each generation. So what I have next is a timeline. See if you can see it. It's right there in black and white. I have a little timeline, a bit like I did in the previous episode, except this one's going to be a lot quicker. Title of my sex tape. Here we go. 1952. Australian National Science Fiction Convention held in Sydney. 1975. The 33rd World Science Fiction Convention, WorldCon, is held in Australia, Melbourne. Dubbed AussieCon, it is considered to be significant in the development of Australian activity in science fiction and fantasy. 1995, Armageddon, that's the convention in New Zealand, is created in Wellington. 1996, Madman Entertainment is created as an anime distributor and starts distributing Japanese anime and pulp culture throughout Australia, changing the face of fan costuming forever. 1998, anime and manga clubs from 3 Melbourne universities hold a joint anime screening and barbecue for 6 hours. This event was so successful that it was repeated for the following years. Year 2000, Comic Fest is created and held in Sydney. 2001, the anime screening and barbecue transitions from a barbecue party to a full-fledged anime convention and becomes known as Manifest. 2002, the convention's AV-Con, held in Adelaide, and Animania, held in Sydney, are developed. Also in 2002, Comic Fest is rebranded into Supernova. 2003, Supernova expands events to Brisbane. Animania follows in 2005. Excuse me, more hot coffee. Hot coffee is the best. 2006, Anime expands events to Melbourne and becomes part of the official Australia-Japan Year of Exchange program. That was a international exchange program between the countries of Australia and Japan, organised by the Australian government. And Animania became a part of that, due to it being an anime and video game convention. So, 2007, the Sydney manga and anime show, codenamed Smash, is formed in response to a lack of conventions focusing on doujin, that's fan-created Japanese comics. It is the first convention to also host a maid and butler cafe during the convention. But it will not be the last. 2008, Supernova follows Animania to Melbourne and also establishes a convention in Perth. 2009, Animania expands events to Adelaide. You can almost feel like these conventions are in competition with each other, trying to conquer each capital city around Australia to see who becomes the largest pop culture convention in the country. 2009, Madman Entertainment launches the first National Cosplay Championship, focusing on acting skills. 2009 also, Australia enters the World Cosplay Summit held in Japan. 2012, Supernova expands events to Gold Coast and Adelaide, while in 2013, Manifest shuts down and Animania shuts down in 2014. So, all in all, I'd say Supernova won that little battle between pop culture conventions. 2016, Brisbane cosplayer Major Sam wins the 3rd annual Crown Championships of Cosplay with her cosplay of Juliet Necromancer. 2016, Madman Entertainment creates its own convention and hosts its own cosplay competition instead of distributing it amongst the other conventions. In response, 2018, Supernova creates the Cosplay Odyssey competition. So now we've got 2 cosplay competitions going on at the same time. Once again, one focusing on skits and acting skills, and the other focusing on costume quality. 2019, Sydney cosplayer A.K. Wiru and Japan-based cosplayer K Cosplay wins the World Cosplay Summit with their duo cosplay from Monster Hunter World. But we have some sad news. Madman Entertainment's cosplay competition shuts down in 2019 as well. Then in 2020, COVID-19 hits and screws everyone. 2022. COVID-19 pandemic quarantine efforts are lightened, conventions are reopened, get-togethers are allowed again. And Sydney cosplayer Tagakun and Gold Coast cosplayer Natalie win 2nd place at the World Cosplay Summit with their cosplayers of Princess Zelda and Ganondorf from Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. Alrighty. That's it. Cosplay history in Australia from beginning to end, starting in 1952 up till now. We started with Western science fiction conventions, and then the World Science Fiction Convention popped over and fan costuming exploded. Then Madman Entertainment brought anime and manga, and so the cosplay culture popped over. And right now we have a fan costuming culture and the cosplay culture in Australia. I think we neutrally agree to exist together now. But again, there is conflict and, well, and self-identity issues and stuff like that amongst the older generation and the newer generation occasionally. But all in all, we're a pretty happy bunch down here in the land down under. Anyway, that's it. Australia cosplay history. I'm going to take my hat off now. Hat. Awesome. Hope I haven't bored you. This is quite literally half the length of my previous episode. You're welcome. I hope to hear from you again in the next episode, which I believe will be types of cosplayers and types of cosplay. So that's going to be a long list and ever evolving, so it'll probably be inaccurate. Not much else to say. If I missed anything, please let me know. Comments are also welcome if you have ideas on how I could improve on my presentation, or if I need a speech therapist, please let me know. This is That Cosplay Guy Michael, signing off. Nanu. See you next time, Shazbutts.